Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today for episode 709 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today I am joined by our guest, Dr. Tim Buschman, to talk about life and science. And this episode is made possible with support from our sponsor, Innovative Research. Listeners, Innovative Research has provided scientists with quality lab products made in Michigan for more than 20 years. Their portfolio includes human and animal biologicals, assay and ELISA kits, antibodies, and more. Products can be purchased directly from their website by credit card or purchase order at www.innov-research.com. That's www.innov-research.com. They offer small quantities, bulk purchases, and custom orders. From human whole blood to specialized antibodies, Innovative Research has what you need to succeed in the lab. And today, our guest, Tim, is going to tell us more about his lab and his life. So, listeners, get ready to meet another one of our fantastic people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest, Dr. Tim Buschman. So, Tim, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Well, we are excited to learn more about you and more about your work in our interview today. But before we get into the details, let me first take a moment to tell our listeners a little bit more about you and how you got to your current position. Listeners, Tim is Associate Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Princeton University. He received his bachelor's degree in biology from Caltech, and he was then awarded a Postbaccalaureate Intramural Research Training Award to conduct research at the National Institute of Mental Health's Laboratory of Neurophysiology. Next, Tim completed his PhD at MIT, and he remained there to conduct postdoctoral research before joining the faculty where he is today at Princeton. Tim was awarded the NIH Director's New Innovator Award in 2014, and he holds multiple patents related to his research. And today, Tim, we're excited to get to know you, of course, as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
I think when I'm not doing science, I have a family. I have a 15-year-old and a 9-year-old. And I think whenever I'm not doing science, I'm more or less spending time with them. And we like to try to have as many adventures as possible. So whether or not that's traveling and trying to see different things, we just spent a week in Arizona, which was super fun. We like to do a lot of hiking. Well, I guess I like to do a lot of hiking. The kids put up with it, I guess. During COVID times, we hiked the Batona Trail, which is like a 50-mile trail that runs through kind of central New Jersey through the pine forests, the pine barrens out here. It was a great experience. I mean, we would go out every weekend. We'd drive and walk 5 miles and then drive back home and then come the next weekend, walk another 5 miles. And it took us about a year to do the whole thing, I guess twice, because it was always out and back, but it was a lot of fun and I think it was a great time. So we just like to spend as much time outdoors as I can, despite having a job that keeps me indoors all the time. I really enjoy being outside.
Oh, absolutely. And I think hiking is a great way to kind of pull the family together away from the TV, away from all the screens. So that sounds like an amazing experience.
It's really good at generating theta rhythms too. And so walking always seems to sort of like bring out the best thoughts and generate the most creativity. So yeah, it's fun.
Absolutely. I think that can be great for your personal life, but also for your science. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about your research side as well. So Tim, how do you describe your work to someone who's not familiar with your field or not in science at all?
My lab is interested in trying to understand what we call cognitive control. And the way I usually explain it is cognitive control is just your ability to control your own actions towards achieving your goals. It depends on kind of the situation you're in, what you want to accomplish, who you're interacting with and how you're interacting with those around you. And all of that kind of has to be integrated together in order for you to direct your behavior. I think colloquially, we might think about this as kind of like willful control of behavior. So how do you sit down and plan to write a book or go to grad school? So those are kind of like large scale cognitive control, but you also have at each moment in the day, right? You can choose which podcast to listen to, or you can pay attention to the podcast, or you can pay attention to something else. Cognitive control kind of spans these different levels, whether or not it's these life goals that you're trying to achieve, or the moment-to-moment control of your actions and your behaviors in order to achieve, whether, again, it's like a short-term goal or a very long-term goal. And so we think about this really as a very uniquely human behavior, or I think it's a big part of what we think about as what makes us human. But this is something that's sort of evolved, of course, through evolution. So you see it in other animals as well. And so my lab primarily uses animal models to study and understand cognitive control. Of course, our eventual goal is to understand it in humans. And the reason for this is kind of twofold. One is an important part of, again, how humans are so flexible and how we're so intelligent. So when we think about how can we apply this to machine learning and artificial intelligence, it would be really useful to kind of be able to put some of these skills into machines, which they don't really have right now. And then on the flip side, there's also a lot of neuropsychiatric and neurodegenerative diseases that impact cognitive control. And so by understanding the basic mechanisms that underlie cognitive control, we can gain some insight into how these might be disrupted by these various diseases and try to develop treatments for these different diseases.
I love that your work has both these clinical implications as well as potential applications on this computational or maybe industrial side. And I'm excited to dive more into your research as we go through our conversation today. But I think working on one of these cutting edge, exciting areas of research can be really motivating and inspiring. And I love talking to scientists about what motivates and inspires them. So Tim, do you have a particular quote or maybe a mantra, something that plays in your mind that really keeps you motivated and inspired?
I think there's like basic motivations for studying science, which has always been just this idea that was driven me towards is just like this thought that like, okay, you could have a thought or you could have an idea that nobody has had. And not to say that it's unique. Of course, science is an incremental thing where we're building on each other all the time. And it's not like I'm having some thought that nobody has even like gotten close to, but this idea that you can add something and it's sort of uniquely yours and you're adding value and understanding to the world and helping to write textbooks and things like that is just really what's driven me broadly. And I think I got into neuroscience just because it's just so cool. It's just such a fascinating thing that is incredibly complex and difficult to understand and is daunting at times. But at the same time, it's just really exciting and exciting to see the progress that we've made over the last 10, 20 years that I've been in the field. It's been really a lot of fun. I think in terms of quotes, it's not really a quote, but one of my like non-science heroes is Cal Ripken. So I grew up in Baltimore. I was born in Baltimore. I grew up playing baseball. I'm a Baltimore Orioles fan. And when I was growing up, Cal Ripken was sort of like the leader, kind of the main person on the Orioles. And he had an amazing career. And part of what made his career so amazing is that he played every single day, right? And I think even he would admit he was a fantastic baseball player. But even he would admit that he was not the most skilled baseball player, right? He was, of course, a Major League Baseball player, so way better than I would ever be.
Right.
But at the same time, right, it's not like he wasn't the most naturally gifted. But he just worked, and he worked so hard. And he ended up breaking Lou Gehrig's record for most consecutive games. I think it was like, 2130 was when he broke it, and he ended up going on, I think, for a couple hundred more games. I just always think of that, and I'm always inspired by that. In fact, I have a poster in my office that my parents gave me of the Baltimore Sun or the Washington Post sort of highlighting that achievement, because it just sort of reminds me that this perseveration and this drive is really such an important part of being able to achieve and do anything. So this is something that I think a lot about and I talk a lot about with my mentees and think a lot about.
Absolutely. I think showing up is the first step to great success.
Yeah. And being able to he was fighting through injuries at times in his careers. And we tend not to get many injuries doing science, but you do get setbacks, right? And actually science is kind of strange because it's like a field in which you get rejected more than I think you get positive accolades, right? Like anytime you submit a paper and it gets accepted, it's probably been rejected 3, 4, 5 times before that. And so it's just a field of constant rejection, and being able to fight through that and being able to push through that, I think is really key to being successful and being able to stick around.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned Cal Ripken as one of these inspirational figures for you. Are there others that really rise to the top of your mind as people who inspired you or served as role models or maybe just had a big impact on you in your career?
I've been absolutely blessed to have just an amazing series of mentors over the years, both official and unofficial. I mean, my grad advisor, Earl Miller at MIT, was an amazing mentor and always open and willing to talk and bounce ideas around. And it was just such a creative and supportive environment that really allowed us to kind of pursue science and try to do the best science that we could. But there's also these sort of unofficial mentors who have definitely had like huge impacts on my life. And one that I always think about and remember was, so when I was at NIH, so after college, I went to NIH for a year and I was working with Pascal Fries and Beth Buffalo, who were both postdocs with Bob Desimone, who was at NIH at the time. And I was applying to grad school and trying to make a decision between two different graduate programs and honestly between two different labs, one of them being Earl's lab. And I remember just running into Leslie Ungerleider, who was another principal investigator at NIH at the time. And we had said hi to each other in the hallway, and she just asked how it was going. And I just mentioned offhand I was trying to decide on grad school. And she was like, well, let's sit down and talk about it. And we sat there for an hour. She had nothing to do with my life. Like I wasn't in her lab. It was just a sort of chance encounter where she was willing to take an hour of her life, hour of her day, and sit down with me. It was just like this post-baccalaureate student who hadn't done anything. And she was willing to just sit there and talk through what my interests were and what the different labs were and what are the pros and cons of everything. And at the end, she was like, well, it sounds like you have to go to Earl's lab. And I was like, okay, I will. And I did. And it was fantastic. And not to say that if I'd made other choices, it wouldn't have also been good. But I think a lot about that because it's just this case where somebody was just open and willing to help somebody else out and provide. And again, it was like a very unofficial mentoring, but it had such a huge impact, like a very like nonlinear effect on me. And I try to parrot that, right? I try to remember that and kind of honor her style, right, in my own mentoring and make sure that when people come to me for advice, I try to give them the time. So, yeah, I think for me, at least, like my path through science has been, I was trying to think about it this morning and I was thinking like, it's kind of like a pinball machine where you're going along and then like some bumper hits you and you go flying off in a new direction. And I think that Leslie was definitely one of those bumpers. And, you know, I've had many, many different mentors, both, like I said, official and unofficial, that have really shaped my career, but also who I am as a scientist and how I think about the brain and things like that.
Absolutely. I love that you use the word chance encounters too. I think you're absolutely right. So many scientists that I've talked to have had these unsuspecting moments, these transformative moments that have really changed the trajectory of their careers or really helped them make an important decision or realization. So maybe we'll walk it back all the way to the beginning. Tim, what really sparked your interest in science to begin with or got you set on this particular path?
As far as I can remember, I've always wanted to be a scientist. Again, I think it was sort of just this drive to try to create knowledge, create understanding that other people would find cool and interesting. And that was really it. I mean, as far back as I can remember, I was obsessed with baseball as a kid. It was either a scientist or a professional baseball player. Professional baseball player didn't work out, so I guess I became a scientist.
Here you are.
But I honestly don't know. I mean, my mom's a chemical engineer. My father was a physicist by training. So they were not in academia, but they were both around science. And it was something that we kind of grew up with because actually another one of my siblings has a PhD and a lot of us have been around science and where we married scientists. Like it seems to be part of our culture. I don't know if it was intentional or not on my parents' part. And then when I started in research in high school, actually, I went to high school in kind of close to DC. And there's a high school in Montgomery County, Montgomery Blair, that has a math science and computer science magnet program. And it was just a really wonderful school that really had amazing teachers and amazing opportunities. And one of the opportunities was starting in your sophomore year, you could start doing research. And one of the advantages of growing up in the DC area is that like there's all these national labs nearby. And so again, it's like one of these cases where it's just happenstance or luck that I happened to be in the right sort of environment where we could really pursue research when we were in high school, right? Sophomore year in high school. Actually, these days I often wonder, I don't even know if you could do it anymore because of the legal ramifications. But
right. The liability.
Yeah, I think back, like, well, who was letting a 15-year-old in a lab? Like, that's just ridiculous. But yeah, I mean, it sort of started there and built. And I started off doing red blood cell aging, studying in an Army Research Institute under a PI named Dr. Victor McDonald. And he was very welcome. It was a very small lab. It was a great place to grow up scientifically. And he was very welcoming and allowed freedom, which was great because it's like you can make mistakes and figure out how things work and don't work. And I spent about 3 years there throughout all of high school doing that. And even though I don't do anything related to it now, it was just like really learning how to do science, I think is really the key thing. And that you can then apply it to different fields. But yeah, that's kind of where I started. And as far as I can remember, that's kind of always what I wanted. And it's just, I mean, I remember like graduating college. I graduated college in 2001. And all of my friends were like, this is like in one of those dot-com bubbles. And all my friends were going off, getting huge signing bonuses and buying these super fancy cars that would be like 5 years of salary for me. Where I'm like, I'm going off to grad school to earn $25,000 a year. And it didn't bother me. It never really bothered me. I was just always very excited to get the opportunity to do science and do cool things.
Oh, that's awesome. So then what ultimately turned your eye towards neuroscience?
Like I said, I started with red blood cell aging and biochemistry. And then when I went to college, I was very much like, I'm going to study cancer. And I joined the lab with Paul Sternberg at Caltech, where I was an undergrad. And I tried really hard. I did, but I was just so bad. He was working with worms and trying to study genes and the genetics of cancer biology in worms. And I just couldn't handle the worms. I just like physically could not pick them up. Right. And so it's like, I just failed. So like, I kind of was a little bit lost at that point and then ended up taking a class on machine learning, like very early days of neural networks and training neural networks to do different tasks. And obviously I've been very interested in biology and I had been doing some computer science, and this was kind of like the new cutting edge of computer science, or one of the cutting edges of computer science at the time. And then as soon as I sat in that class for like 3 weeks, I was like, oh, this is it. I want to do this, but in biology. And it just clicked for wanting to do neuroscience. And so I moved and I started I was already a biology major. And so I just basically started taking all neuroscience classes and ended up joining a lab of Christoph Koch, who was at Caltech at the time, is a brilliant computational neuroscientist and is now at the Allen Institute. Yeah, his lab was like it was just a wonderful lab to kind of grow up and see and learn a lot of computational neuroscience. But when I graduated, I felt like it was a lot of fun building models of the brain, but I wanted to get back into something that was like real and biological. And so that's kind of how I ended up taking the year off for personal reasons, but also in part to try to get back into more kind of experimental neuroscience rather than theoretical neuroscience. And I just happened to find this position, again, totally luck. I happened to find this position in Bob Desimone's group. And again, it was like one of these epiphanies where Bob at the time, and still does, work with non-human primates or monkeys and trains them to do these really cool tasks, like attention tasks, and allows us to study how does the brain pay attention to things? How does it decide what to pay attention to? Like, what does that mean? And I had no concept really, I think at the time, that like you could even study this, right? That you could do this and train animals, do these really complex and cool things and begin to take them apart and understand like what is actually going on in the brain to do this. So again, like it was just like another epiphany. I was like, oh, okay. It's like not only do I want to do neuroscience, but I want to do this specific type of neuroscience. And so for my career, at least, it was very much wandering. I don't think it was really intentional. It was just a bit of like random events that I happened to take this class and I happened to have this conversation and saw this job posting and ended up finding the thing that I think I really love to do.
Oh, that's awesome. And I'm so glad you shared this story, Tim, because I think sometimes you're absolutely right here. You have to try some different things in order to figure out what is a good fit, or maybe to figure out what is a bad fit in the case of the worms. But I think a lot of students are sort of hesitant to be seen jumping around into different fields and kind of experimenting, trying different things because they're worried about what that'll look like on their CV or resume.
Yeah, I think I talk to a lot of undergrads who feel like they have to know what they're doing. I mean, you sit down with somebody and you're like, okay, what are you interested in? And I usually, when I ask this question, I mean this in like a very broad way. And I always immediately follow it up with saying like, I understand this is going to change, right? I'm not saying like, write down your 10-year plan now. And I think that's really important because I think you're right. These days, there's a lot of pressure and it's just gotten so very competitive that you feel like everybody else knows what they're doing and has this like real vision and is achieving their vision. And that like, if you're a little bit lost, then you're going to fall behind and you're not going to be able to achieve whatever goal that you want to achieve. And I think the world is more competitive than it was when I was coming up. But even so, what I usually try to convey to people, my mentees, is that everybody kind of has their own race to run and your path may be different than somebody else's path, but that kind of reflects your skills and your uniqueness. And at the end, when you do kind of settle on what your research question is going to be and how you're going to do research, whether that's in academia or not, how you're going to do your science, you're going to bring all of those experiences to bear. And over the years, I've tried to sort of come to terms with, I mean, like I'll look around and say, oh my gosh, this person's doing such amazing science. Like, I wish I was that. Like, I wish I could do that science. And then you just realize like, yeah, that's great. It's great to appreciate other people's science and their contributions, but I try not to take it as like my own personal failing, because it's like, sure, I can't do that science, but I have my own voice that I can contribute. So I just try to encourage students, again, whether or not they're undergrads or graduate students, to kind of embrace their own unique way, their unique journey, which leads them having a unique perspective and a unique voice, that they have something valuable to say, as do other people, right? And we can appreciate that. But that doesn't kind of diminish their contributions and allows them to embrace a little bit of the randomness of what scientific careers often are.
Absolutely. I think following your own path and just acknowledging that research envy happens sometimes. And I know you are doing some really cool work in your lab. So I'd love to talk in a little bit more detail about some of your projects. So Tim, is there one in particular, maybe at the moment, that you are just the most excited about that you want to share more about with me and our listeners?
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm really excited about right now is we're interested, like I said before, we're interested in cognitive control. So how do you guide your actions? And when we think about this at the neural level, like how does the brain accomplish this? We often think about it as essentially like routing information. So if you're doing something where like you want to read a paper, right? Like how do you sit down and read an article, let's say on your computer, right? You have to focus your attention. You have to focus your visual processing on your computer screen, and you have to ignore things in the environment. You have to be processing that and thinking about it and incorporating it with long-term memories and things like that, right? So there's a series of kind of processes that you have to engage. Then you can imagine trying to tell somebody else about it, right? So now you have a motor output in which you have to engage. So when we think about kind of tasks, we think about how do you get the right type of information coming in from the outside world to the right internal processes that you can compute on them or process them in the right way. And then how do you get that result to the right motor output so that you can act on the world? So a lot of it is thinking about like, how do you move information through the brain? Well, the reality is, right, like if you look around the world, it is incredibly complex. There's so much going on, especially in kind of like modern lives. It's like a very busy, a lot of stimulus drive coming from a lot of different places, a lot of things trying to grab your attention all the time. And you just can't process all of that. The brain has limited processing capabilities. So even though we have this percept that you're seeing everything at once, for example, you actually are really only processing one or two things at any given moment in time. And this is probably for good reasons. And so we have to think about like, okay, how do you select that? But then how do you get that information to the right place? And that's sort of how we think about cognitive control. It's like filtering down and then routing to the right place. And so there's been a lot of work. I mean, this isn't a new idea. This is kind of like the way that cognitive control has been thought about for, I would say, probably 20 years or so. But the question then becomes like, how is the brain doing that? How is it moving information from place to place? And there's been different models that have been proposed and different ideas that have been put out there. And what I'm really excited about is that we've been thinking a lot about kind of a new model of cognitive control that relies on the geometry of the way in which information is represented in the brain. So again, this is not like we're working in isolation in this. There's lots of other labs that are working on this as well, and lots of great work from other people. Just to give you kind of an intuition for how we think about this. The way I think about it is like, okay, if I am holding a book in my hands and you're trying to see what is the title of that book, and I'm holding the book kind of flat on the table, right? You're sort of just seeing the edge. You can't see the spine. You can't see the top. You're just seeing the edge of the stack of pages, right? In that way, you can think about the title as kind of being hidden from you. And then if I just rotate the book, it was flat, but now I tilt it on its end so that you can now see the title. Right now, you can process that information. You can read it and you can act on it. And we think that the brain is doing something similar where you can think about instead of you viewing a book, maybe there's a brain region that is going to do some task with that. Reading could be it, right? But it could be other things like naming the color of the book or judging the size. You can imagine doing lots of different things with it. And so the idea is that the brain is holding these things in a way that there's different downstream brain regions that are doing these different processes may be hidden from them. And then just by rotating it, which is just a really simple operation, just turning it a little bit, all of a sudden it pops into view of these downstream regions. And so then they can act on it and they can process it and you can use it to engage in different behaviors. So that's what we think is going on. I think it's such a cool idea that it's moving things between in and out of different views to kind of like allow the brain to see different parts of it, right? You can even imagine kind of showing one part of it, but not another. Maybe you can show the title, but not the back of the book. So we're kind of like really interested in how does the brain do this? What are the mechanisms that allow it? We have a lot of evidence, and again, like not just from our lab, but from other labs, showing that this seems to be what's going on. And it does seem to be something that's under cognitive control. So like if you wanted to read the title of the book, you would rotate the book in one way. But if you wanted to read the back of the book, you'd rotate the book in a different way. And the brain clearly is doing that. It's to me just so fascinating. And so now the question becomes, how is it doing it? What are the mechanisms that are doing this? And like I said, then how can we think about this for artificial intelligence? And how can we think about this in disease and is disrupted in different diseases like schizophrenia or autism? And it's just really exciting. It's kind of a new idea. And that's sort of the thing that I'm at least infatuated with at the moment.
I love it. I think that's really interesting and exciting. This idea that the brain is manipulating the data or the signals to facilitate its processing. And we're excited to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Innovative Research, and to briefly talk about their portfolio of human biological products. Listeners, Innovative Research is well known for their human whole blood, plasma, and serum, but they also supply other human biologicals and matrices such as saliva, tears, sweat, and urine. Available donations from FDA-approved collection centers range from healthy adults to samples from individuals with specific diseases. So listeners, contact them via email at sales@innov-research.com. That's sales@innov-research.com to find out how they can provide human biologicals for your research study today. And going back to our interview, Tim, I imagine that you encountered challenges in your research. Like you said, you're working on this new idea, this new way of thinking about cognitive control. And there are a lot of challenges in science, and we hinted at a few of them, just this idea of constant rejection. So, Tim, do you have a particular challenge that you're struggling with right now, or maybe a major failure that you've experienced in your career that you can tell us a little bit more about?
First of all, I've been incredibly lucky in my career. But there's always difficulties, like you were saying. There's always kind of this constant rejection, whether or not it's grants or papers. Maybe a talk doesn't go well. There's always this kind of both real and perceived rejection that happens. And I think, like we were talking about before, there's always this sense of imposter syndrome and like, oh, I'm not very smart, or I'm not able to do this thing that somebody else can do. And these are things that everybody kind of always struggles with. I don't think they're unique in any way to us. And again, I feel like more often than not, a lot of it is chance. It's 100% chance. And I acknowledge that. And the ball has just bounced my way a couple of times. For me, I just try to remind myself that when we get papers rejected, and we just had a recent paper actually around these ideas of rotations where I was like, this is a really cool idea. And you start shopping it around and other people are just somehow not as infatuated with it as you are. And you're just like, what am I missing? Is it not interesting, or am I not selling it right? Like you start second guessing yourself. So I started research very early. I've been doing research all through college up to grad school, but I never published a paper. And I was just in places and in groups that for whatever reason, it just didn't happen. I don't know. There just wasn't really a strong drive to publish, I guess, in the Army. And then in college, it just never happened for whatever reason. So when I got to grad school and I went to publish my first paper, I was so excited about it, in part because it was my first paper, but also because I thought it was a really cool result. And I remember actually thinking about like who I was inspired by to do the work. And also at the same time, like I remember writing the paper with my graduate advisor, Earl, and being like, these are the people who I'm like sort of like have in mind, like they're going to think this is so cool. And we submitted it, and well, it was rejected first, but then got published in the second journal. And I was like, okay, this is really great. And it was sort of like, I think generally well received. But one of those scientists that I had in mind as like, this person is going to love this study and they're going to think it's so cool because it's really building off of their work. And it's like a continuation of their ideas. Just really hated it.
Oh, no.
And ended up writing this letter to the editor, basically trashing the paper, right? And saying, this is the worst paper and it's got all these mistakes and blah, 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 blah. And I remember being completely deflated by this, in part because it was my first paper. And here's somebody like coming along and saying this is bad science. And
right.
In part because it was him in particular that I was like super excited to have read and enjoy the paper. And he clearly didn't. And it was also a difficult time in my life. My wife and I just had our first son. And I remember like having to respond to this letter sitting in the hospital. My wife literally had just had her son, and they take the baby away and bring him back, regular hours and things like that. They try to give you some rest in the hospital. And like during those rest periods when she was recovering and sleeping, I was sitting in the corner and working on this response letter to this letter that had been written to the editor about how bad of a scientist we were. And I think in the end, like actually it ends up probably being a good thing for my career because I think people like drama. And so it was fine. I think we were able to make our arguments and make our case for why maybe we weren't the worst scientists in the world. But I think it ends up working out in the end.
Yeah, I think you learn and grow from those experiences. It's hard to have them, like you said, as your absolute first paper, but probably good to get one or two angry editor letters under your belt before you become a faculty member. That way you've got the thick skin in advance.
Yeah.
So it sounds like this was a big challenge, but perhaps ultimately had a happy ending. And we love talking about these happy endings, these success stories in science. So Tim, do you have a favorite success story, whether it was a big one or just a small but particularly meaningful victory that you'd like to tell us about?
I generally just find a lot of joy in these small victories, right? Like hanging out at a whiteboard and writing down, thinking about some data and coming up with some like new idea. And then like that aha moment where it kind of all clicks and you suddenly realize, oh, this is how it works, right? It just feels right. Like you just have this intuitive rush, this feeling that like, oh my gosh, this is the answer. I've been lucky enough to have that happen a couple of times in my career, and I could point to many, many of them. I remember we collected some data from one of my graduate students, Alex Libby, in my lab was collecting data from mice listening to sequences of sounds. So the mice were just hearing these tone sequences that you can think of as like kind of like little chords in music. And they were just hearing like A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D over and over and over, right? Like, it was like the world's worst music, mouse music. And what we're interested in trying to understand is like, how do you build association? So if you hear the sequence, right, as soon as you hear A, you kind of know. If I just said A to you and I'm like, okay, respond, you probably would be like, I don't know, B. We've learned these associations of sequences and things follow each other. And so we were kind of interested in understanding that. And to do that, you have to not only know what you're seeing now, right? But you also have to think about what you have seen in the past. So you have to kind of have this mixture of like immediate sensory representations, like what are you hearing? And then what did you hear in the past so that you can build them and associate them together and say, every time I hear B, it's because I heard A before that. And you have this memory of A and that's mixing with this sensory input of B. And we were curious about kind of how this was being represented. And we were I remember sort of, as everything in the brain, it's always complicated. And so we were able to find these two representations. The brain is clearly doing both of these, right? It's representing what it's hearing now, but it's also representing this memory and it's doing it in the same neural circuit. And we weren't quite sure how that was working out. And then we found out that actually it's kind of representing them in these two is orthogonal dimensions, right? So these are two like different axes, right? So like an x-axis and a y-axis, they're kind of 90 degrees from one another. And if you think about like the XY axis, right? If you move along the x-axis, it doesn't move you along the y-axis. And vice versa, you can move along the y-axis and it won't change the x-axis, right? So they're two independent variables, I guess is the other way to put it. And it turns out that the brain was kind of encoding sensory and memory in these two independent ways. And the sort of aha moment came when we were trying to understand how does the sensory, so like when you first hear A, it's represented in that kind of sensory vector along that sensory kind of dimension. And then over time, like as time goes on, a sensory input becomes a memory. That's sort of the natural progression. Like you hear something and then it becomes a memory and then you hear something new, right? And then that will become a memory. And so there's this kind of constant dynamic transformation of something that's being a sensory representation into a memory representation. And that's what we were seeing, but we weren't quite sure how it was happening. And I just remember being like, well, let's try this analysis where we were going to take a very unsupervised approach. We were going to like just let the data tell us what it's doing. And so we ran this very simple clustering rhythm on the neural responses and like out popped these two different types of neurons that we found some neurons that are stable. And then we found some neurons that like will switch their responses over time. And it turns out that the combination of these two things is enough to get this rotation. So you initially represent things along sensory, and then because some are the same and some are changing, that actually will cause this rotation where it will move into a memory. And so it was this super cool moment of, oh, I guess if we had sat there for, I don't know, 5 years, maybe we would have come up with this hypothesis. But sometimes you just have to listen to the data and it will tell you how the brain is working. And so, yeah, there's a lot of these kind of moments in time where you just get these aha moments or really little bursts of dopamine that keeps us going.
Absolutely. I think they can be really motivating and inspiring and kind of encourage you to dig in deeper, ask more questions and do more work. And I always try to encourage our listeners to take a step back from the science at some time so it doesn't become all consuming, to read broadly, try to broaden their horizon. So we love talking about books on the show as well. Tim, do you have a favorite book that you'd like to recommend for us today, whether it's related to science or not?
They're both kind of non-science, but one that's definitely very far from science is I really enjoy the Malazan series from Stephen Erickson. It's like a fantasy series that it's just an amazingly rich world. And he's an anthropologist by training. And he just wrote these series of books they're an investment. There's like 10 of them. And well, at this point, actually, I think there's even more than that, but 10 in the main series. And it took me like a year and a half or so to read them all. But it was just like, yeah, one of those year and a half was just like amazing reading. The other book that I've really enjoyed recently is the What If book. So there's 2 What If books that are from Randall Munroe, I think. These are books that I read with my kids. So Randall Munroe is the comic who does the XKCD comic. And he kind of gets these questions of like ridiculous things like what would happen if there was a mole of moles dropped on in New York City or something, right? And he just goes through the science and thinking about it and like what would happen. And usually the answer is everybody would die. But it's just the way that you get to everybody's going to die is, I think, just really fun. And it's interesting and not only gives, I think, some sense of the science and engineering behind things, but also highlights, I think, oftentimes like where our intuition might be wrong and that it could be a little bit complicated. And I think that's just really fun. He does a great job of breaking it down. It's got funny illustrations included. And so the kids really, really enjoy it.
Well, these are awesome recommendations. We will add them to our website for our listeners to find there. And we've talked about some different aspects of your career as a scientist. One of the things we haven't really touched on are travel opportunities. I think this is huge for scientists. So do you have a favorite place, Tim, that your science has taken you?
I'm a homebody. I do enjoy going and visiting sites, but my wife, who's also a scientist, she's like the type who just loves that part of it. And I'm like, I just want to be in the lab and doing my science. But there's just so many places I've been that are just so meaningful. I think, and I talk to other scientists, I feel like oftentimes a lot of people feel this way, that science is such a thing where you build on one another. And so I love the places where there's just such a deep history, right? So I think a lot about anytime I visit, say, Oxford, for example, it's just such a really amazing environment, in part because it just has this amazing history and you just know all of the unbelievable scientists that have been there and have done their science there. And it's humbling, but also amazing to be there and be doing a little bit of science there, to feel like contributing to that history, even if it's in a tiny way. Those are the sort of experiences that I really, really enjoy.
Well, that's awesome. I think being part of the history, being part of these new discoveries, this discovering of new knowledge and enhancing our knowledge of the world is one of the wonderful things about being a scientist. And you mentioned, of course, this idea of building upon the discoveries of others. And I think the people in science are often undersold. So we love talking about these amazing people and these great experiences that you get to have as scientists, because I think there are some stereotypes out there, which I've found in many cases not to be true. So Tim, do you have a story or an example of an experience that you've had, whether it's a quirky lab tradition or just a fun or funny memory that you've shared with colleagues that go against some of the stereotypes people might have about scientists?
Yeah, I agree with that, right? I mean, I think a lot of scientists are just very smart people, and it's just really fun. Obviously, we often talk about science, but also outside of that, it's just really fun to talk to clever people who are quick-witted and will come up with a joke. And some of my fondest memories of grad school are actually playing softball with a bunch of scientists. Most of us didn't know how to play at all. Like every year we'd get out there and be like, okay, this is first base. You run to first base. And it was just, it didn't matter. And part of what made it so great is because everybody was kind of bad. So we live in an environment where it's often very competitive. And even though it's supportive and within this lab, you're trying to help each other do great science. My grad advisor used to always say, a rising tide floats all boats. So if somebody does well in the lab, it helps all of us, which I totally believe. And I think helps give this vision of team science, which is really important. But there is always this undercurrent of, yeah, that may be true, but how many of us are going to get professorships? There's always this a little bit of competition. And the nice thing about playing softball was, like I said, it was very, very flat.
The stakes are low.
Yeah, everyone was low. Everyone was bad. We could all be bad together and not have to worry about it. It was also just mixing of professors were there and grad students were there and postdocs were there. And there was no sense of hierarchy. I mean, in general, hierarchy is not all that strong in science to begin with, but still, it was just fun. A lot of comradeship.
Absolutely. I think being able to see these distinguished professors be just as bad at softball as you are can be comforting as well, right?
Yeah. I remember at MIT, there was intramural teams where we play other departments, but then also within our department, we had a softball day where we would all go out and do a little round robin tournament. And Susumu Tanagawa, who is a Nobel laureate who won a Nobel Prize for basically discovering VDJ recombination in the immune system, and then became an amazing neuroscientist, was playing first base on his team. And he's probably 65, 70 years old at the time. And I remember hitting a base hit and then rounding first base and just unknowingly plowing into him.
Oh, no.
Running him over and just feeling oh my God, what did I do? I just ran over a Nobel laureate. And he got up and he apologized to me. He was like, oh, I'm sorry. I was in the base path. And I was like, okay, I'm sorry. Those are the sort of memories I really enjoy.
That is amazing. And I think building the sense of community and camaraderie can be important in science. You're tackling some difficult questions in the work that you do. And often you have challenges, as we discussed, and things like funding, staff, technology, feasibility limit in some cases what you can do. So Tim, is there one question that you would want to answer most if we took away all of the barriers and restrictions?
I think the biggest restriction I usually face is just time. There's a lot that I want to do and just can't get it all done. And I just can't spend the time that I really want to spend on all of these different things. And then, of course, there's work-life balance and things like that as well. But I think the thing that I'm very excited about that I would love to make more time for and build a stronger community within my lab for one of the projects over the last couple of years has been trying to think again about how can we transfer some of the knowledge that we've gained into applying it to disease, right? And one way in which we think we can really apply it to disease is through direct brain stimulation. So if you can stimulate the brain, then you could perhaps treat different neuropsychiatric or neurodegenerative diseases. And of course, we need to have this basic science understanding in order to kind of understand how and where we should be stimulating. And this is something that's already been going on, right? So like deep brain stimulation first evolved for treating Parkinson's, but now is being applied for things like OCD and depression, severe mental depression. And so I think this is a really exciting idea that I keep wanting to find, like people who, again, it's a time thing. And then it's just like people come to your lab and they're interested in doing X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z so far hasn't been this. So this is something that I would really love to continue to build. We've done a little bit in this domain, right? Thinking about how would you actually do this and how would you do it in a way that you could really apply to a lot of different diseases. And actually one of the patents that we hold is in this domain. And so it really is something that we've thought about and we've started to make some progress on, but I really want to pursue that over the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, this is a fascinating area of research, and I think there's so many unanswered questions to be tackled. So we will keep an eye on your work to hopefully continue making progress in this area. And we've covered a lot of ground today, but I'd love to end with advice. So, Tim, is there one piece of advice that you received at some point in your career that you can pass on to our listeners today to help them as well?
I remember when I was in grad school, my grad advisor often redirecting me and saying like, okay, think about what your long-term goals are. Think about what you want to achieve here. And even if it's unfair, even if you have to allow something wrong to happen, not like severely wrong, but even though you might be right and you may be able to prove it, right? Like, is that really helping you in your career and able to achieve what you want to achieve? And so I think this is something that I think a lot about because I still have this like innate inside. I just have this drive like, oh, that's not fair. And oftentimes I have to kind of come back and say, okay, what is the best way for me to achieve not only my goals, but like I'm responsible now for, a lot of other undergrads and grad students and postdocs. How do we achieve their goals and how do we find the right way for them to be able to move forward in their career? And sometimes being humble and being able to accept something that you may not perceive as fair. That's been something I think a lot about. Yeah.
I think that is a really important lesson. It's tough to learn. You can't fight every battle. You just have to let some things go.
Exactly.
So that is a wonderful message to share with our listeners. Tim, is there any other last piece of inspiration you'd like to share today or a last message you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think that the same sort of idea, right? That you just kind of have to continue to fight through and have some faith and belief that, like I said, you have a unique voice, you have your way of doing science that's valuable and that you can contribute. And whether science or not science, to be honest, I think it's the same thing. And at the end, if you continue to put work in and you're doing good work, that like it will be recognized and good things will happen. I think I see a lot of people who think like, okay, the way to get ahead in science, and again, I think this is outside of science too, is to like make connections and do this and that. And that definitely helps. I'm not saying it doesn't, but I think at the end of the day, just focusing on running your race and doing your science and doing good science that at the end of the day, you should be recognized for. Of course, it doesn't always work that way, right? There's a lot of luck involved as well. But that's the advice I usually try to share with my students and mentees.
Absolutely. Just keep going on your own path. I love it. Well, Tim, if our listeners want to learn more about you and more about your work, what's the best way for them to do so?
The best way is probably just through my website, which is my name, timbuschman.com. And there's contact information on there. There's information about our current projects. You can find our publications are all available on our website. And I'm always happy to chat and try to channel my inner Leslie Ungerleider and provide advice and whatever. Yeah.
I love it. Well, listeners, definitely check out that website. Get in touch with Tim if you have specific questions. And Tim, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for taking the time.
It was a pleasure to chat with you. And listeners, always great to have you here with us as well. Join us again next time for another episode of People Behind the Science.